It's finally happened. It's finally here, available streaming. The Mr. McMahon documentary that all of us fans speculated wildly about for so long is finally out. And I think I, like a lot of hardcore fans, could not help but to binge the entire thing. 6 parts that are at least 1 hour apiece, I think. Felt like that anyway. All in one day. Partly because, hearing the story of Vince McMahon as told by Vince McMahon is something that I think a lot of people thought we would never get. And years ago, when we heard this was in production, it was a huge deal. So the fact that it's finally here and so much has changed in the life of Vince McMahon, as well as in the world of WWE altogether since this was first announced. I think we were all wondering how all of this would be handled. So here we are with an instant reaction review to Mr. McMahon, the 6-part documentary series that's on Netflix. It's not a WWE produced piece. That's pretty obvious. It's Bill Simmons, I guess, and The Ringer produced it. Here's the thing, okay? And like I said, I watched it all, and there are going to be a lot of spoilers here. So if you haven't watched it, and you're not using this as like a Cliff Notes version of it, you might get frustrated. So you might want to finish it and then bookmark this and come back to it, because there will be spoilers here. But the good news is, if you want to watch this and you're worried about spoilers, there was almost nothing in the documentary that hasn't already been talked about by wrestling fans all over the place. So don't worry too much about spoilers. It would be like getting mad that I came on here the night after the movie Titanic came out and let you know that the boat sinks. The series starts with kind of Vince McMahon. Every episode has like a cold open, and some of them are really interesting. Like the episode 3, the Screwjob episode, that's kind of where they tell the story of the Wendy Richter Screwjob, which gets ignored a lot of times in contemporary sort of history telling when it comes to WWE. There was one where he was talking about, who was it? Dr. Jerry Graham, who is Vince McMahon's favorite professional wrestler, which, again, not necessarily new information, but still cool to see Vince McMahon talk about who his favorite wrestler was, since kind of the reputation that he's got is he was never that big of a wrestling fan. He even liked the term pro wrestling. And he talks about that in the first episode, that's where he was, I don't even like the term. I don't even like saying pro wrestling. It's bigger than that. But the cold open for episode 1 is the series starting with Vince McMahon saying that he wishes he could tell the real stories. Basically saying he's not going to tell all the real stories. And the director's like, well, why don't you just tell him? And he's like, no. And that should they should have put that in the preview, because the preview made it seem like we were going to find out all the stories. But instead, what I found this to be was a well-made, well-produced, broad strokes history of the WWE from the time that Vince McMahon bought it up until current day, with some cut-ins of Vince McMahon giving sort of brief sound bites on all the controversies that he's been through as part of this history of the WWE. But you take away so much more information about what happened in the WWE than you do about Vince McMahon, the human being. I mean, I thought that, the most interesting stuff in the first episode and throughout the whole series was whenever you can get Vince talking about family. Like Vince talking about growing up in the first 12 years of his childhood. He didn't even know his last name was McMahon, I think he said. He didn't know his dad. He finally met his dad. He didn't get love from his dad. He talked about the physical abuse that he suffered at the hands of his stepfather. But really, he didn't even really get into stuff that he has said in other interviews his mother had done to him when he was a kid. He was actually more forthcoming about how rough the first 12 years of his childhood was in the interview that he did with Playboy, like in the early 2000s, than he was in this first episode here, kind of setting everything up. But he does talk about kind of the cold relationship that he had with his father, and it starts to shed a little bit of light on maybe the way that he is with his emotions. He talks about how the first time his father ever said that he loved him was the day before he died. Like right before he died, he finally told Vince that he loved him, and Vince said, that felt really good. That felt really good. As opposed to being like, that was kind of a messed up thing that I had to wait that long for. He almost was like, hey, that's okay. And the fact that he didn't really get sort of appreciation from his father, or a pat on the back, or an I'm proud of you, until after he had not only gone to battle with the territories, which his dad didn't want him to do, but he had won. Once it looked like he was going to win, his dad finally said, fuck them all. Good for you. And Vince said, again, that felt good. But thematic of this whole thing is whenever Vince talks about this stuff, even when it's like rough stuff, clearly he's just of the mindset that when something bad happens to you, you put it behind you, you throw it away, you never think about it, you never talk about it, and you move forward. Just focus on the positive, focus on the positive, focus on the positive. And sometimes that doesn't work for all of the demons. When you talk about the talking heads in this thing, I thought Bob Costas was great throughout. He had a couple of real zingers. Bob Costas did. I thought he was very good. Dave Meltzer, I thought, served a great purpose in this thing, kind of acting as the contrarian a couple of times. Not even that much, really. But here and there, kind of adding a little bit of non-company context and contrarian context. Not that all of it, not that he was right and they were wrong, or they were right and he was wrong, but just the fact that that voice was there, I think added value. But then you had, all the big names in wrestling. You had John Cena, you had The Rock, you had Hulk Hogan, you had Bret Hart, you had Shawn Michaels, you had Triple H, you had The Undertaker, you had Tony Atlas, you had Bruce Pritchard. Yes, Tony Atlas. He was in this too. Trish Stratus. Tony Atlas actually had a big part, which I was like, okay, I didn't realize we were going to be seeing so much from Tony Atlas. But ultimately, you leave the first episode going, okay. So I waited all this time. You produced a document. It took 4 years to make this documentary. You got to sit down and interview this guy, which nobody does. They said there were hours and hours and hours of footage of Vince McMahon interviews and big name interviews about Vince McMahon, Bret Hart, whoever it was. And at the end of the first episode, you mean to tell me that Vince bought the company from his father, took the company national, went into territories, and the territory owners didn't like it, started rockin' wrestling, and then gambled everything on WrestleMania, and it was a success? That's what I get. Wow. I had no idea. That's a true story. I'd never heard that before. Unbelievable. They get into the early controversies with the kind of mainstream media people, the John Stossel getting smacked by Dr. D. David Schultz. But again, you don't really learn anything new about it. Richard Belzer getting choked out by Hogan. You don't really learn anything. I mean, what is there to learn about it other than Vince going like, hey, that was bad. And Hogan going like, yeah, I guess that was bad. Phil Mushnick coming in episode 2 or 3, whatever episode it was. That was a surprise. Phil Mushnick is a reporter for the New York Post who, since the early 90s, I think, has been writing negative pieces about the WWE. He loves writing negative pieces about the WWE and professional wrestling in general, but mainly WWE. And I didn't even know who he was when I was a kid, even though I lived in New York, because what am I reading the newspaper as a kid? Until he was mentioned on WWE TV. Like Vince would actually use television time to shout out Phil Mushnick by name. So the fact that Phil Mushnick was in this, it was interesting. They get into, the rise of Hulkamania post WrestleMania 1 and how really the rise of Hulkamania and WWE becoming this larger and larger and larger thing. They were happening at the same time, and one doesn't happen without the other, and vice versa. And they get to WrestleMania 2, they get to WrestleMania 3, and they talk about Hogan and Andre, and how, this was the match. This is what they needed to do. That basically WrestleMania 2, it was a spectacle, financially successful, but didn't have the oomph. Wasn't a game changer the way WrestleMania 1 was a game changer, but WrestleMania 3, they needed it to be. So they said they filled up 93,000 seats in the Pontiac Silverdome. And I went, I don't know if that's statistically true. But then Meltzer was there to be like, yeah, I don't think it was 93,000. They show everybody going, 93,000, 93,000, 93,000. And Meltzer's like, it's 78,000. I don't know how many it actually was, but I appreciated the fact that conversation, the fact that number is disputed, was at least there. But either way, a huge number of tickets. Vince admitted that this was not the first time Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant had a match. We all knew this, of course. But hearing them, not just print the legend and say that, I thought was a good thing. Hogan and Vince both went into their stories about Hogan didn't know if Andre was going to let him win or not. Hogan didn't know if he was going to win until the Hulk Hogan did not know if Andre the Giant was going to let him win at WrestleMania 3 or not story needs to be retired from all wrestling documentaries. If this is your first wrestling documentary, maybe that's an interesting story. But every documentary about Hulk Hogan or Andre or Hulk Hogan and Andre, they all have the story where Hogan's like, I didn't know who was going to win that match until Andre let me win at the end of it after I hit the leg drop. And it's like, I've never believed it to be true. It just doesn't make any sense. It's nuts. Like, Hogan knew. He was the biggest star in the company. He wasn't an up-and-comer. Can you imagine if Andre went into business for himself in the main event of WrestleMania 3 in front of 93,000 people? It was never a possibility. Sorry. They kind of moving a little bit fast forward as they're talking about how WrestleMania 3 blew up Hogan and blew up the WWE. How they bounced off that and got bigger and bigger. They talk about Hogan trying to get into film and how Vince tried to slow him down by doing No Holds Barred, which I loved the fact that they even mentioned No Holds Barred. They get to all the way to WrestleMania 6. They don't mention Randy Savage much at all. There's some photos of him, some video footage, but they mention him when they talk about WCW a little bit, that Randy Savage was the next to go to WCW. But other than that, they don't really mention, they don't mention WrestleMania 4 and 5 or anything like that. And you can't mention every single rivalry. They go to WrestleMania 6, and they mention the Ultimate Warrior very, very briefly. They don't talk about him, demanding money, walking out, holding up Vince for ransom. They just go, he won the title. He didn't really work as champion. We had to bring Hogan back. And that's kind of it for the Warrior. And that might be on purpose. That might also just be for timing. They can't tell every single story. In fact, there's only a very few matches that they can actually concentrate on. Let's tell the story of this match. And Hogan Andre is, of course, one of them. They don't tell the whole story of Hogan Warrior, but they do tell the whole story of Hogan Slaughter. And I think that's because there was controversy around it. And they kind of let it off with this idea of, hey, when we started this thing, it was a conflict. It turned into a war when we were in the middle of it. Who knew it would get this hot? But it got too hot. Everybody admits it. And they let it go. They don't talk about WrestleMania 7 moving venues. Because I was wondering, are they going to go with the official story or the rumored story? They don't talk about it going from the stadium to the arena in Los Angeles at all. They kind of just talk about how hot that got. And that's kind of the lead in to the run of scandals that the WWE got into, post WrestleMania 7. Vince talks about the WBF a little bit, and he says the reason they shut down the WBF was because of the steroid scandal, because they were all on steroids. I thought it was because it wasn't going to make any money. It's a bodybuilding federation, but apparently it was the steroid scandal. But this is where we go scandal heavy. They talk about the Ring Boy scandal, the referee scandal, the Rita Chatterton scandal, and the steroid scandal, all happening all at the same time. No, again, real new stories about this. The only one that went to court, they talk about the Donahue appearance a little bit. The only one that ended up going to court, obviously, was the steroid trial. And they show Vince in the neck brace. It's always funny to see Vince show up to the courtroom in the neck brace. But while this is all happening, they're trying to demonstrate how, whether he deserved it or not, they definitely don't make it seem like he didn't deserve it. They just point out that, hey, a lot was happening all at once to Vince. And they talk about how Hogan had left at that point, right? Because they do shout out Hogan for lying on Arsenio Hall's show, and how that was the beginning of what's become the meme now of Hogan lying all the time, and how it was a mistake. How even then everybody knew he was lying. It helped nothing. It just made everybody go in the media and go they had this montage of Bruno Sammartino and Dr. D. David Schultz and all these people going I injected Hulk Hogan with steroids. They talk about Hogan leaving WWE to go pursue a film career, and to kind of, everybody was booing him because his act was getting stale and because of the steroid scandal. So he realized it was time to bow out. He got a release from his contract, and they talk about how he ended up going over to WCW. Eric Bischoff joins the docuseries. And Vince does say, and I thought this was interesting, when Vince is talking about his feelings, when you're seeing an inkling of who the real person is, for a second, this thing gets interesting and not like stories that you've already heard a million times before. He says it broke his heart. He says that hurt. You know, as much as he lives in this world where it's just business, Hogan, he thought was a lifer. Hogan would never betray him. Hogan said he'd never work for the competition. He goes, he works for the competition. Now, at the same time, it's complicated because even though Hogan worked for the competition and broke Vince's heart, he also went to the steroid trial, and his testimony saved Vince. They thought the prosecution thought they had a smoking gun witness in Hogan, but Hogan was on Vince's side. Again, all this stuff we kind of already know. It's just I'm kind of talking about it's fresh on my mind after watching it. And that was probably Hogan trying to be like, okay, I just like really screwed him over by going to WCW. Let me have his back a little bit over here. And he's probably telling the truth too. Well, it's Hogan, so as much truth as Hogan is going to tell. They get into the new generation. Bret Hart, talks about kind of taking over the mantle and enjoying it. And they show him and The Undertaker and saying that athletically it was some of the best wrestling they'd ever had. But they talk about how it was tough. And WWE with all those scandals and with WCW now getting hot. And they show the NWO and the rise of the NWO and them coming together and everything. And the fact that it could have been Vince that turned Hogan heel. But Vince would just never turn Hogan heel, which is interesting because he would never turn John Cena heel either. But so he didn't learn from this mistake. Like, he never turned Hogan heel. Hogan goes to WCW and turns heel and has a second run that some you could argue is as successful as the first Hulkamania run. If not, it's still a huge money run. And it's interesting that Vince never was like, oh, I didn't do this with Hogan, and he went and did it over there, made them a lot of money, and almost put us out of business because of it. Maybe I should do it with John Cena, and just never did. Just an interesting thing. But as they're talking about the trouble that WWE is in financially and the new generation and things not working out, that's also when, they start talking about the rise of the Attitude Era, how out of control everything went. We all know the story. The Montreal Screwjob is contextualized at the beginning of the episode with the Wendy Richter thing, like I talked about earlier a few minutes ago. And then, they're talking about the Monday Night Wars. They're talking about Farewell to the Clique. And they contextualize that somewhat interestingly in the sense that they talk about how, all the old timers were mad, but the younger guys enjoyed it. Cody Rhodes is on this thing. And he's talking about, being a young man, seeing this happen and thinking it was awesome, but recognizing that the older people didn't like it. Triple H and Shawn Michaels talk about how you did have to notice that it's what the fans reacted to the most that night. And that maybe times were changing and they talk about how Vince just wasn't ready to evolve that far yet. That's when Hunter, tells the story about being on the phone with Vince and Shawn and saying, well, if he's not going to do it, why don't we just do it for him? A story that we've heard before about the Montreal Screwjob. And, they explain the Screwjob, Bret going over to WCW, the whole thing. It was fun. Bret Hart describing punching Vince McMahon in the face. He's very prideful of that punch. He gleefully describes the uppercut. Vince says he got punched in the temple. He says, Bret punched me. I put my hands down and allowed Bret to punch me, and he punched me right in the temple. Somehow he walks out with a black eye from getting punched in the temple. I don't know how that could happen, but anatomy is not my specialty. I just watch a lot of professional wrestling. So Bret, describes it as he's described it a million times before. Tie up, uppercut. Vince goes flying up in the air and slams down the whole deal. It's great. So Vince is then asked, because they get into sort of him playing the victim when WCW is poaching all the WWE talent, even though it's very similar to what Vince McMahon did in 1984 when he was poaching talent from territories. And Vince has this very interesting quote where he talks about how in business, you don't always say, like, I feel a certain way, but that doesn't mean it matches what I say. He says in business, you oftentimes don't say what you feel. You say one thing, but feel something completely differently. And he says it's an effort to control people's thought processes, which was really nuts to hear out loud. I'm sure it happens all the time. I'm sure every major executive does that, but to just go like, hey, this is what we do. Don't you know that? It's interesting. So we're getting into the Attitude Era. I mean, probably my favorite moment of this whole thing was Vince insisting that the Attitude Era was still family-friendly content, that they didn't cross the line, and somehow it was still family-friendly content. He said no guns, no knives. They show guns, they show knives. They showed like no killing. They showed Boss Man getting hung in the Hell in a Cell. He says that the Attitude Era was indeed family-friendly content, which I was like, I don't know how you've convinced yourself of that, but apparently you have. They talk about the rise of Stone Cold Steve Austin, the rise of The Rock. They get into the Owen Hart stuff, which is really a tough watch. The Owen segment, and they question whether, the decision to go on with the show. I think, watching that, it's hard to agree. Vince still stands strong that, well, even if it had happened to me myself, I would have wanted to go on with the show. But, you can't watch that and go, man, that was the right choice at that time. It was the choice at the time. Hindsight is 2020, but looking at that through hindsight, we know what the decision is through 2020 vision. And then they talk about the creation of Mr. McMahon. And Vince says that he created Mr. McMahon based on a contempt that he had for the rich, that he grew up very, very poor. And so seeing these rich people who all thought that they were better than him and were condescending to him, he developed this attitude towards people that were rich, and he portrayed that person. And that's how he became the heel that he became. And there is a conversation, throughout about what a performer, what an incredible performer Mr. McMahon was. And that's true. He was. But then they say, what are the similarities between Mr. McMahon and Vince McMahon? And Vince says there are none. Vince says Mr. McMahon and Vince McMahon, no, totally separate. There's no similarities there whatsoever. We have nothing in common. They ask every single other person, and these are people close to him. These are his children. And they go, I mean, it's pretty much the same guy. Maybe a little amplified, maybe up to 11. But yeah, Mr. McMahon and Vince McMahon are pretty much the same person. And Vince is over there going, no, not true. Which, again, is the problem with this whole thing. We never meet Vince. We don't know anything. I don't know anything more about Vince McMahon right now. I mean, it's so they get into the family here, and again, the family is where I think this thing is strong, because that's, at least to me, what's interesting. Because now you're talking about a guy's personal life. They talk about Triple H and Stephanie, and Linda's in this thing too, which is a cool thing. But they talk about Stephanie and Linda. Stephanie and Triple H getting together, getting married in storyline, getting married in real life. They talk about Stephanie was looking for a venue for her shoot wedding, for her real life wedding. And she said that Vince wanted to put it on pay-per-view. He had the idea while they were venue shopping to put the thing on pay-per-view. And she was like, no. And I think he called her like, oh, it's very selfish or something like that. Like, can you imagine? He wanted to put his daughter's wedding on pay-per-view. And they talk about, getting Stephanie involved in the show, getting Shane involved in the show. And it's two very different stories, and it's weird. They get into, the pregnancy storyline that was pitched to Stephanie that's been talked about before and all that stuff. He's forgotten about the Sable thing. He forgot about the Sable lawsuit. He doesn't remember anything about that. And he doesn't remember anything about the Sable storyline when she got back to the WWE after the lawsuit, which is interesting. Possible, I guess. He remembers all the other lawsuits, but I guess he doesn't remember the Sable stuff. They talk about the win of purchasing WCW and how it was a very quick decision. Brian Gewirtz is on, talking about being on the plane flight where they bought WCW. Followed, though, after the WCW is purchased and the WWE goes public, but then kind of right after that, they lose the WWF name, the XFL fails, and, of course, Bob Costas does the interview with Vince McMahon that does not go well. I'm sure Vince thought it was not going well for Bob Costas, but in reality, it was very hostile. It wasn't going well for Vince McMahon, but I think most of us have seen that interview. If not, look it up on YouTube. It's amazing. That's where we start to hear about the dynamic, again, of Shane and Vince McMahon. And this is, Shane going through kind of everything that he had to do to prove himself to his father. And it's very cyclical. It's very cyclical. And I'll talk about that in a moment because we get to a real cyclical point in episode 6. This is still episode 5. But basically, Shane got to a point where he wanted to show his dad what he could do. Dave Meltzer says he wanted his dad to buy him a promotion so that he could run it and say, hey, look, this is what I'm capable of when you're ready to let me take the seat. Shane tells the story of wanting his dad to buy UFC and that his dad didn't want to do it because he didn't like the MMA business because you can't make stars in the MMA business the way you can in the professional wrestling world, which is true. But Shane wanted Vince apparently to buy UFC so that Shane could run UFC and that could be his own thing. Shane wanted to be that next McMahon in the great line of McMahons. And of course, Vince, with all the heart in the world, says, well, if Shane wanted to buy UFC, he should have bought it with his own money, but he didn't have enough. It's like, okay, cool. And Paul Heyman tells this insane story of Shane McMahon and Vince McMahon, which basically, is a creative dispute that ends with Vince McMahon telling Shane he's going to have to stab him in the heart if he wants to make the decisions and take the company. But if he's not going to stab him and be man enough to stab him in the heart, that's something Vince is going to remember. And then Shane goes, you know what, I'm out. And that's the first time Shane leaves the company to go pursue his own stuff. In the last episode of the series, which it felt a little pieced together, I'm going to be 100% honest. It starts with Vince McMahon explaining he has 3 brains, which he doesn't really break down what the 3 brains are for, but he says they're all kind of acting and talking to him at the exact same time. They ask him what the 3rd brain is doing right now. And he says it's thinking about having a lot of fun involving sex. And you're like, okay, that's so weird. They squeezed Trump stuff in the top of this episode to be like, okay, Trump was involved. It doesn't really go anywhere, in my opinion, but it's there. And then they also talk about the limo explosion, which I love. I loved the limo explosion storyline, chronicling the limo explosion on the radio for the radio show I was working for at the time was one of the first big bits I got to do. So that's always got a place in my heart. But the limo explosion storyline is just there to set up the Benoit stuff. And they spend some time on the Benoit stuff. Again, nothing new, nothing sort of that reveals anything, no insight. We don't even really get a story about why, how on Monday they thought it was a tribute show, and on Tuesday it was like we got to erase him from everything, how people were in the media, how all this stuff was going on. We really don't get in depth with any of that. All we really get into is that Vince doesn't really believe that concussions were involved, and then we get to Chris Nowinski, who talks about, the concussion research he's done, and that while Vince doesn't think concussions were involved in the Benoit thing, they did kind of initiate a new concussion protocol after Chris Nowinski brought CTE evidence to the table for them, which I thought was good. And while they were talking about concussions, they also talked about the Undertaker's streak ending, which Vince felt like what happened in that match was not due to the Undertaker getting concussed, but because the Undertaker was so traumatized about losing the streak, which, big if true. I'll just say that. There's another great Shane arc in here because Shane comes back. Vince calls Shane to set up the WrestleMania 32 match. Now, we don't get into the locked box that was never unlocked. We don't get into any of that stuff. But it's more about, this is where they talk about all the risks and everything that Shane took. And Shane freely admits so much of it was just to get his father's approval. And after WrestleMania 32, that Hell in a Cell match with The Undertaker, he takes the dive off the top of the cell, goes through the table, the whole thing. He gets that hug from Vince. And keep in mind, Shane is a father of 3 at this point. He gets to bring his sons out to the ring with him. But he's still, even though he's clearly, or he comes across as a great father who loves his family and loves his sons. And he's even described in this thing as like, well, that's who Shane is. Like, Shane's a nice guy. Shane's not, Vince even says, like, Shane's a little more sensitive to the stuff with his mom and everything. And they go into, like, all the like affair storylines and the Trish storyline with Vince and Linda in the wheelchair, but it's all just like, yeah, it was a storyline. You know, there's nothing there. But Vince hugs Shane after Shane goes off to Hell in a Cell. And Shane talks about it exactly in the last episode, the way Vince talks about how much he needed his father's approval. And you realize that even though Vince has said people who are abused tend to abuse, you know, their children, but I think that that's a cop-out, you still realize that there is a cycle here that Vince is repeating. But that's almost a side plot to just going over all the stuff that happened in the WWE. And then Vince stops doing the interviews because the newer accusations and evidence and everything come out. The Wall Street Journal reports come out, and Vince is kind of done with this documentary. But they still, and you know, here they just kind of run through all the news stories. They don't have any real new information on it. And then they play sound bites from interviews that happened before the accusations came out. And it does contextualize, like, wow, it's wild that right before these accusations came out, people were like, he'll never retire. Vince is like, I don't even understand why people do retire. And you realize, I guess, the severity of all this stuff. Bruce Pritchard is also on, like, the day before the accusations came out, talking about how he had seen a few of the episodes of the doc, like of episode 1, 2, 3, as they're filming episode 6, and talking about how he thought it sucked and it was a hit piece. And, you know, I mean, ultimately, is it a hit piece on Vince? To an extent, but not, I mean, they don't do anything to make him, it's not a puff piece. So if it's either a hit piece or a puff piece, if it's one of those two things, but I don't think it's a hit piece. You know, there's a lot of controversy in Vince McMahon's life, and it's covered here. I think that where this thing is very flawed is that there were a lot of resources poured into it, hours of interviews with Vince McMahon. You had Bret Hart, you had Shawn Michaels, you had John Cena, you had The Rock, you had Hulk Hogan, you had Linda, you had Stephanie, you had Shane, you had Bruce Pritchard, you had Tony Atlas, you had everyone, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Undertaker. And 4 years. And we got, you know, the broad strokes history of the WWE with some, you know, sprinkling of, hey, you can speculate on what they're really like behind the scenes based on these two quotes. This was advertised as, you know, we'll find out who the real Vince McMahon is behind the Mr. McMahon character. And we're no closer. We're no closer whatsoever, you know? I mean, I can't imagine anyone's opinion getting shifted one way or the other. It's almost like a nostalgic trip down memory lane for wrestling fans with a constant reminder that there's been a lot of messed up stuff that's happened as well. And that's what it is, you know? So, you know, ultimately, I sit there and go, man, if I had hours to sit down and talk to Vince McMahon on camera, there's so many questions to ask him. And when you realize, well, he's not getting into his family, he's not getting into this, he's not getting into that, fine, go in this direction, go in that direction. Even if it's not like where you think this documentary is going, just get him to talk about anything. Like it's a very rare opportunity, especially right now. And unless there's a whole bunch of footage and they're going to put out a part 2 or there's other stuff or they had to change things because they wanted to shift more to like the news stories and stuff like that, you know, ultimately for a wrestling fan that's a hardcore wrestling fan, it was like, oh yeah, I'm just getting reminded of history that I knew, you know? And it is what it is. That's kind of where I landed on the Vince doc. These are my feelings right now. This is what I thought. I'd love to hear what you think if you want to leave it in the comments and all over the place. Maybe we'll talk about it more on the Monday episode of Notsam Wrestling. Appreciate you guys listening. I hope you guys do watch the series. And if I'm way off in some things, let me know. Talk to you soon. Have a good one, everybody.